Hello, YouTube. Welcome to 70 Years of Moving Mud, a history of iron bombing podcast. This is episode 15. Where are we? Now, in this episode, I do actually want to talk about where we are and where we're heading in the podcast, which is funny because it's also what the episode is about, which is navigation and navigation systems. But before we get started on talking about that technology, let me give you a picture of where it fits in and where the podcast is going. In the last few episodes, we've talked a lot about doctrine. We talked about doctrine before the Korean War and how it shaped not only the tactics, but also the aircraft that flew and the way the pilots were trained to fly them. And, it turns out it's a bit of a closed loop, actually. Aircraft technology allows for new designs. Pilots fly the new aircraft. They have opinions about how it should be used. They develop new tactics, techniques, procedures, and they ask for new functions and capabilities to make those easier. Designers respond, and the loop repeats. The issue is that without a major combat laboratory, this can lead to a whole system that is not very well adapted or prepared for the reality it gets itself into, especially if it's been around that loop a few times without having been tested. Now, this is definitely what happened prior to the Second World War with the so-called bomber mafia effect. The U.S. Air Force, or the U.S. Army Air Force, entered World War II convinced that the way that they would make any enemy surrender was to mount a strategic bombing campaign while the Navy and the Army just sort of kept them occupied for a while, and that strategic bombers would bring any enemy to its knees and force them to surrender. This turned out to be quite untrue. Now, then, at the end of the Second World War, there was a renewal of this effect with what I'd call the atomic bomber mafia effect, which was essentially the same argument all over again. It had been pretty conclusively proven that strategic bombing couldn't take an enemy out of the war, but that atomic bombing could. So again, this was a question of a doctrine that was developed based on the last combat experience, but not necessarily the next one. And the Korean War burst some of those bubbles because the U.S. Air Force did not end up employing its Strategic Air Command during that combat. But it also led off into some particular directions that didn't end up necessarily being relevant to the next major air war, which again was in Asia, and again ended up being against a far less sophisticated enemy. So we have now spent a few episodes talking about those directions. We've talked about the technology explosion that came after Korea. It's almost time to talk about how this shaped doctrine and training and ultimately new aircraft design, with effects that were not altogether beneficial when it really mattered, frankly. In fact, in some ways, it actually saw the Air Force, in particular, during the combat, going back to older designs, because the new ones weren't effective in the roles they actually had to fill, because they weren't the roles they'd been designed for. But before we get into all of that, there's one more technology area that I want to talk about before we go back to talking about doctrine and tactics. That's going to be in the next episode, and we're almost there. But like I said, we have one more technology to talk about first. We've talked about science and technology of aerodynamics and manufacturing, and how that issued in a revolution in aircraft performance and completely changed the nature of airplanes, at least the ones that military flew. We've also talked about how these airplanes became more and more complicated and complex, as avionics also developed, providing new capabilities that were increasingly seen as being crucial in combat. This meant that aircraft design became as much about what could be stuffed into an airframe as it was about the performance characteristics of that airframe. We focused last episode specifically on radar and how it became smaller, lighter, less power-hungry, and more automated so that it actually migrated from being a ground-based system to being an airborne one. It was sufficiently advanced technology, though, that the mastery of it was widely seen as a crucial differentiator in the upcoming conflict. Having capable airborne radar when the enemy did not was seen to be a key that would unlock not only air superiority, but air supremacy. So, for engaging enemy aircraft, radar was seen as essential. But radar was also being developed as a tool for attacking the enemy on the ground, as a means of seeing at night and in bad weather. In this, though, it needed to be combined with one more technology, or set of technology, and that was a working navigation system. Because there's really not much value in seeing the ground in the dark or in the rain, if you don't know what piece of ground you're actually looking at. And, figuring that out is no simple matter. Again, this is one of those things that we've kind of become used to, especially in the last 20 years. And we don't really remember how big a deal it was before the advent of GPS. We're so used to being able to locate ourselves on the surface of the planet that we forget that this once was an act that required some special skills or some pretty advanced technology. And as a former artillery officer who learned the trade before GPS was a thing, I can tell you that out in an unstructured world, like off the highways, it takes some serious effort to learn how to find yourself on a map. Not doing it accurately can have grave or hilarious consequences, but you know what? Let's not go there at the moment. Suffice it to say, though, that figuring out where you are is hard enough in the front of a vehicle bouncing over the ground at 20 miles an hour. Doing it in an aircraft at 400 miles an hour is another story entirely. Now, sure, if it's a clear day and you're high enough to spot all the landmarks, you've done your map recce and you've been following along, it might not be that bad. It's still bad enough, though. Just ask any VFR pilot who, say, on the prairies where they, might have learned to fly, ever flew low enough to read the names on the grain elevators by the railroad tracks so they could know what town they were flying over and figure out actually where they were on the map. Not saying I have any personal experience with that effect. At any rate, compare that to being 100 feet off the ground at 400 miles an hour, and you realize that this is a truly significant problem. And when the weather closes in or the sun goes down and you can't see the ground, well, it's pretty much impossible. So put both of those conditions together, and you are in the realm of a truly existential problem, but it is one that Air Forces desperately wanted to solve. So navigation aids have long been something that Air Forces were interested in. To be fair, so were civilian airlines and, pilots in general, because one thing is certain. What goes up must come down eventually, and you'd way rather be near an airport when that starts to happen. So you really want to know where the nearest one is. The first solutions to the problem were centered around radio technology and were really enabled by the advances made in the 1920s and 30s. These solutions relied on radio direction finding, meaning allowing a radio receiver to determine the direction to the source of the signals it was receiving. This isn't really a tough problem. For reasons we talked about last episode, designing an antenna that's highly directional, meaning very sensitive to the direction of the incoming signals, is really not hard. The challenge in the early days was to get the antennas small enough that they could be carried on an aircraft and light enough and simple enough that they could be rotated in real time so they could map the strength of the incoming signal as a function of direction. And this, of course, could only be accomplished by using radio frequencies that were high enough, and hence wavelengths that were short enough, to be picked up by such compact antennas. And again, as we talked about in the last episode, which you really should listen to if you haven't, the advances needed to generate radio waves in this range, hundreds of kilohertz to hundreds of megahertz, really only appeared in the late 20s and early 30s. Now, within a few years, though, a radio direction finding was pretty much a thing. And actually, many World War II aircraft feature systems to home in on radio beacons. But the one feature of these systems, though, was that, unlike all radio technology at the time, the systems were not only pretty large and pretty heavy compared to modern radios, they were also complicated and, finicky. They lacked the automation that modern systems have. Both tuning the set to a given signal, keeping it tuned that way, and determining the direction of the source of that signal really required a well-trained human operator that was very much in the loop, which meant that the technology was well suited to large aircraft, especially with multiple crew members, one of whom was almost always a radio communications expert. Nonetheless, as the technology continued to improve during and after the war, some kind of radio direction finding equipment became more or less ubiquitous in aircraft of the day. As well, non-directional beacons began to proliferate at airports and other important landmarks to help aircraft find their way to and from these points. And that's one thing actually to keep in mind about radio-based navigation. It required ground infrastructure in order to work. In fact, most of the complexity was on the ground. And that meant that in some ways, the pacing item in the adoption of these technologies was the means and resources to build the ground infrastructure on which the technology really depended. Now, the next breakthrough that really gained full acceptance was something called Very High Frequency Omni-Ranging, or VOR, or TACAN, which was the military version and stood for Tactical Air Navigation System. The importance of this innovation was that it allowed somebody in the aircraft to approach the VOR station from a particular direction. Now, this is very useful because when you're planning a landing, it means that you can shape your approach to the airport so that as you approach it, you're lined up on the runway. So when the runway is finally in sight, you're aligned with it. If you don't do this, you have to navigate to the airport and then fly around it until you're in the right place, which is a task that actually can be very complicated if the visibility is poor, since keeping the runway in sight and being far enough away from it to start an approach may not be two things you can do at the same time. So let me just briefly explain how VOR works. Essentially, the VOR station produces two signals, radio signals, that are modulated in different ways. One is amplitude modulated and one is frequency modulated, if you care. Now, one of these modulations is omnidirectional. It's the same in all directions. The other is varied by direction. So by comparing the two signals, it's possible to determine what direction the signal you are seeing was emitted in. So using this system, you can just fly towards a VOR the same way as you would a non-directional beacon. But you can also fly around it until you are approaching it from a particular direction. And of course, you can select that direction in the cockpit, and you would normally set it to correspond to one of the runway directions. Then the VOR technology was combined with something called DME, or Distance Measuring Equipment Technology. DME is a pretty simple system. It basically works by allowing an aircraft to interrogate a ground station and listen for a response. By timing how long it takes for the answer to come back, the range to the station is established. So you put the two together and you get something that in civilian terms is called VOR DME. In the military, it's called TACAN. So the combination of an approach vector and a range meant that aircraft could manage their descent and approach to an airport runway, even in very poor visibility. You didn't need to see the runway to know that you were lined up on it and how far away it was. Now, eventually, VOR DME systems were supplemented by instrument landing systems, which would also allow the measurement of glide slope, and that basically enabled the full instrument approaches that we're all familiar with. It was effective. It became widespread when the solid-state electronics revolution made receivers cheaper, lighter, and easier to maintain and use. By the 1960s, VOR DME systems were pretty much ubiquitous, and TACAN was pretty much on all military aircraft. And you know what? It stayed that way until they began to be replaced by GPS systems, or, in a lot of cases, they still exist today. But while TACAN was a very effective system for guiding aircraft precisely to their destination, it has its limitation as a tactical system, despite its name. Primarily, the limitation is that enemy forces tend not to be all that interested in deploying systems to help enemy aircraft find their targets. And while it's possible to actually use TACAN to guide aircraft from a friendly point to a point in enemy territory, and which was done by the United States Air Force in Vietnam, this strategy is honestly of pretty limited utility. The main limitation is that TACAN is really pretty short range. It operates at frequencies high enough to make it a line-of-sight system, meaning that the signal can only be detected if it would be possible for you in the aircraft to see the ground station on a perfect day with perfect visibility. The range is thus effectively limited by any terrain that intervenes, but also even by the curvature of the Earth, and neither of which makes it much use as a system for guiding aircraft on low-level, long-range tactical ingress routes flying nap of the Earth. To support this kind of flying, pilots needed a system that was really quite different. First of all, it needed to be standalone. It could not rely on any external signals because those could not be relied upon when flying that kind of profile. Now, again, note this is one of the big differences between 1960 and today. Today, with the prevalence of space-based navigation and communication assets, it's always possible to look down and communicate with almost any point on or above the surface of the planet. So it's pretty reliable. But in 1960, that wasn't at all true. And again, that's a fact that we often forget. The system also needed to be pretty simple to operate. I mean, even in a multi-crew aircraft, the aircrew were going to need the system most when they had the least attention to pay to it. In other words, flying low and fast in low visibility and in close proximity to the enemy. Proximity to the enemy also meant that it was absolutely could not require the aircraft to emit or broadcast a signal as part of the process, since that would give away the aircraft's position to anyone who was listening. I refer you to the prior discussion on radio direction finding. What was needed was to somehow improve the pilot's knowledge of where he was by making a better and more accurate record of where he'd been. In effect, this was a system used then and still by pilots all the time manually. It's often referred to as dead reckoning, which is a term that's actually been around, for centuries. It refers to the process of being able to calculate where you are by knowing where you were and estimating, or reckoning, what direction you traveled in, and at what speed, and for how long. And with enough care and attention, this is a system that can be actually surprisingly accurate, although you have to be trained pretty carefully to use it. But again, it's not a system that is really amenable to being used by a rapidly maneuvering aircraft whose aircrew have much, much more pressing matters to attend to, like staying alive, close to the ground, and in a hostile environment in low or no visibility. So the solution to the problem, it turned out, arrived from space, or more accurately, it came from the space program. It was a technology that appeared first in the United States, pioneered by Robert Goddard in the 1930s, but it was really perfected, or at least significantly improved, by Wernher von Braun in Germany in World War II, who used it to guide V-2 rockets. It was a technology known as inertial navigation, or inertial measurement. I guess to be fully correct, you would say that an inertial navigation system, or INS, consists of an inertial measurement unit, or IMU, that is integrated with other aircraft systems to provide the pilot with a high-quality estimate of their position based on maneuvers they have performed since they left a known point. Now, an IMU does this by measuring acceleration, actually, by measuring 6 different accelerations. 3 of these accelerations are angular, and 3 are translational. The angular accelerations effectively measure all of the changes in direction that you've made, and the translational accelerations measure how much you've accelerated in those directions. If you remember your high school physics, you'll remember that if you know how much something has accelerated and for how long, you can figure out how fast it is moving. Then, if you measure how long it moves at that new speed and in what direction, you can figure out how far it's gone. And presto, you end up with a position that is really a process of, let's call it, computer-assisted dead reckoning. But it's much better than a human could do. It isn't perfect, though. The problem is that all IMUs rely on independent gyroscopes, which are the way they sense acceleration. Without going down the rabbit hole today, let's just say that this works because a spinning mass like a gyroscope dislikes being disturbed. If you push a gyroscope, it will respond by rotating in a direction that is at right angles to the push. Let's not go into the details. At any rate, this means that any force arising from an acceleration, since they're equivalent, will cause the gyroscope to move very precisely in a particular direction. And if that motion is measured carefully, it can be used to calculate the acceleration. Now, the problem with the system is that gyroscopes stay oriented pretty constantly, but not perfectly. And they also tend to precess in time because, frankly, the Earth rotates around them. The other issue is that since the IMU's calculations are not direct measurements of position, but actually measurements of acceleration, they need to be converted first to velocity and then to distance. And when you do that, the errors really start to add up, especially if every estimate of position requires input from 6 different sources. The net effect is that INSs will always drift and become less accurate over time. Now, that happens at a rate of, say, in the best case, about a couple hundred meters in an hour. Now, given that the platform they're mounted to, an aircraft, is moving at as much as, say, 1,000 kilometers in an hour, that's a pretty small error, something like, 200 parts per million, 0.02%. Certainly better than any human being is going to do. The drift can be corrected periodically by aligning the system at known points, which is why So many of the startup procedures in DCS include steps to align the nav system, or words to that effect, and why those procedures take some time, because they require that all the gyros in the INS be up and running at full speed, and that they have been tested very precisely to measure their responses and make sure they're working. There is a lot going on under the hood in those 3 to 5 minutes while you wait on the runway. Now, as I said, the original inertial nav systems were developed to guide missiles, specifically the German V2. But as I have talked about in another podcast, see the episode on Werner von Braun in my podcast series Terranauts. Werner von Braun worked very hard to make sure that his team of technicians and engineers and scientists was captured by the right enemy at the end of the Second World War, and that happened to be the Americans. Now, the U.S. Army invented something called Operation Paperclip to make those engineers, technicians, and scientists effectively prisoners of peace, so they could contribute to the U.S. efforts to develop its own rocket and missile program. Now, to be fair, after a number of years, most of those paperclippers were offered the opportunity to stay in the United States and continue their work, and most of them did. To the point where German was still being spoken in the Mercury Control Center at the start of NASA's manned spaceflight program, which is a fact that did not necessarily delight either the officials from the U.S. Air Force or from the space program, who felt that this level of dependence on imported technology and imported personnel was decidedly unhealthy. So, in the 1950s and early 60s, there was a decided push to get U.S. companies involved in further developing and commercializing the technologies brought to the U.S. by Operation Paperclip. Specifically, in 1961, NASA gave MIT a contract to do some preliminary design studies on an inertial measurement unit. This was followed by a development contract that went to MIT and the Delco division of General Motors. Within a couple of years, Delco was actually producing a commercial version called Carousel for use in civilian airliners. The system was quickly adapted to military aircraft, and in fact, the A4E features one of the early and very limited versions of it. The system can store 2 waypoints and can be used to cue the horizontal situation indicator dial with both a direction and a range to the selected waypoint. Pretty much all U.S. aircraft appearing after about 1965, though, would feature some kind of inertial navigation system, and many earlier models were upgraded to include it where possible. I don't have any details on that story, but the whole concept of an inertial nav system really became so normalized even by, say, 1970, that I have to believe that it was implemented pretty much everywhere that it could be. It really was that big a deal. And that big deal, along with the advances in radar, truly unlocked the potential of air power that had been desired for a long time, but had never been realized. Suddenly, the time of day and weather were no longer factors in whether a mission could be flown or planned, at least theoretically. This meant that the enemy could no longer hide in the dark or under the clouds, effectively expanding the availability of air power by maybe a factor of 3, and making it much more reliable as well. Theoretically. It's important to add that last qualifier because while the technologies enabled this change of tactics, using it also required a change of mindset, which needed first to be added to doctrine and then trained and assimilated. And then, as in the way of things, air crew would start using it, and then they'd discover how well it worked, but also how well it didn't. And anyone who's developed systems that have end users knows exactly what I mean here. All of which is to say that by 1965, INS was certainly a thing. But it was a very immature and untried technology. But it was also a very advanced technology, a technology that very few people in the world had access to. And the same was true for airborne radar, frankly, and the same was true for air-to-air guided missile, radar-guided missile technology, and a host of other technologies. And this is what we're going to talk about next time, because this was the fundamental context in which U.S. air-powered doctrine was developed in response to between the Korean and Vietnam Wars. By the time of the early 60s, the U.S. had seen and underwritten a massive expansion in its own aircraft industry and in its electronics industry. It was felt with some justification that the United States not only had technical superiority, but even technical supremacy in the air, at least over any adversary that it would face, and particularly if that adversary was not a highly developed industrialized country. But the increase in capabilities had also led to a massive increase in size, complexity, and oh my, the cost of the aircraft that the United States Air Force, Navy, and Marines were flying. And all of these factors would affect the way those air forces intended to fight. And that's what we'll talk about in the next episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.